Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much and welcome to everyone who has joined today. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Celene Ibrahim, who will be speaking to us about women and gender in the Quran, her recent book. And before we start, we'd like to begin the program with the recitation of Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحاقة ما الحاقة وما أدراك ما الحاقة كذبت ثمود وعاد بالقارعة فأما ثمود فأهلكوا بالطاغية وأما عاد فأهلكوا بريح صرصر عاتية سخرها عليهم 7 ليال و8 أيام حسوما فترى القوم فيها صرعى كأنهم أعجاز نخل خاوية فهل ترى لهم من باقية وجاء فرعون ومن قبله والمؤتفكات بالخاطئة فعصوا رسول ربهم فأخذهم أخذة رابية إنا لما طغى الماء حملناكم في الجارية لنجعلها لكم تذكرة وتعيها أذن واعية فإذا نفخ في الصور نفخة واحدة وحملت الأرض والجبال فدكتا دكة واحدة فيومئذ وقعت الواقعة وانشقت السماء فهي يومئذ واهية والملك على أرجائها ويحمل عرش ربك فوقهم يومئذ 8 يومئذ تعرضون لا تخفى منكم خافية فأما من أوتي كتابه بيمينه فيقول هاؤم اقرءوا كتابيه إني ظننت أني ملاق حسابيه فهو في عيشة راضية في جنة عالية قطوفها دانية كلوا واشربوا هنيئا بما أسلفتم في الأيام الخالية وأما من أوتي كتابه بشماله فيقول يا ليتني لم أوت كتابيه ولم أدر ما حسابيه يا ليتها كانت القاضية ما أغنى عني ماليه هلك عني سلطانيه خذوه فغلوه ثم الجحيم صلوه ثم في سلسلة ذرعها 70 ذراعا فاسلكوه إنه كان لا يؤمن بالله العظيم ولا يحض على طعام المسكين فليس له اليوم هاهنا حميم ولا طعام إلا من غسلين لا يأكله إلا الخاطئون فلا أقسم بما تبصرون وما لا تبصرون إنه لقول رسول كريم وما هو بقول شاعر قليلا ما تؤمنون ولا بقول كاهن قليلا ما تذكرون تنزيل من رب العالمين ولو تقول علينا بعض الأقاويل لأخذنا منه باليمين ثم لقطعنا منه الوتين فما منكم من أحد عنه حاجزين وإنه لتذكرة للمتقين وإنا لنعلم أن منكم مكذبين وإنه لحسرة على الكافرين وإنه لحق اليقين فسبح باسم ربك العظيم صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Thank you very much for that beautiful recitation. Thank you all, everyone who's joined today, whether you're joining on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, whether you're joining on Facebook, or whether you're joining on Zoom. Thank you all very much. We are today very fortunate to have Dr. Celene Ibrahim speaking to us on her recent book, Women and Gender in the Quran. Dr. Celene Ibrahim has published widely and is most recently known for her being the author of Women and Gender in the Quran, amongst her many contributions and publications. This book was published just last month or a couple of months ago. She's currently a faculty member in the Department of Religious Studies and Philosophy at Groton School, where she offers courses in comparative religion, ethics, and women's studies. She's also served in the Department of Religious and Theological Studies at Merrimack College between 2011 and 2014, and has offered courses at the Boston Islamic Seminary and Hartford Seminary and other institutions. She holds a PhD in Arabic and Islamic Civilizations and a master's degree in Women's and Gender Studies and Near Eastern and Judaic Studies from Brandeis University, an MDiv from Harvard Divinity School, and a bachelor's degree in Near Eastern Studies with highest honors from Princeton University. Dr. Ibrahim's scholarship and service have earned her a number of awards and honors, and she currently serves on the boards of Boston Islamic Seminary, the Harvard Divinity School alumni, the Journal of Interreligious Studies, and the U.S. Selection Committee of the United World College. Quite an impressive CV. And today we're very fortunate because of Zoom because of the fact that we don't have our session in our hall in Maflali, and today because of that we are fortunate to be able to have people from across the world. And so from the United States, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Celene Ibrahim. Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim.
Virtually, maybe someday our paths will cross in the flesh, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Great. Well, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Ameen. We ask peace and blessings upon all of the prophets and the messengers and the righteous until the end of times. Allahumma salli wa sallam wa barak ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ahli Sayyidina Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ahli Ibrahim fil alameen innaka Hamidun Majid. So my goals for today, inshallah, are to talk a little bit about this question of why in our tradition that otherwise has such esteem for women has so few women mufassira. So women exegetes, women who write on the Qur'an. And those of you who have a nice bookshelf at home, I encourage you to go over and see if you can find a book written by a pre-modern woman in the realm of Quranic studies. And I think you'll probably come up a little bit short, unfortunately. And this is the case because of many different factors. But we have to, I think, be a little bit honest in taking stock of our history and ask ourselves, have we missed something by not having this plethora of women's exegesis of the Quran? And I'll say a bit more about that in a second, but that's one of the questions I want to raise with you today. In my own experience, I found that turning to the Quran is a way to overcome some of the cultural biases that we tend to have in our communities about women's intellect or women's capacity for piety or many other things that I found in my years some degrading perspectives regarding women. And so as we have the Quran, and I'm going to show you ways in which I think the Quran can be a resource for maybe helping people overcome some of these negative impressions that they have. And in my studies of the Quran, I also found really beautiful and subtle correspondences that I think lift up women in a really special and beautiful way. So I'm going to go through some of those today as well. As I'm going through, I encourage you to put questions into the chat features, and our wonderful hosts, inshallah, will be able to get those questions to me once we start our discussion. And now I want to say just a few words about being in this position where there's so many negative stereotypes around Muslim women that we're constantly fighting. And so when I say something like we do not have enough mufassira in our tradition, I don't want to give fodder to people who want to say all Muslim women are oppressed, or Islam is this against women, or any of those polemics that we probably all know so well. But at the same time, I want us to take an honest perspective and say, are there ways in which we as Muslim communities could be better about elevating the voices of our women and one of the ways, I think, is to really elevate women's scholarship. And so I thank you for having me here today, and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that our time together will be beneficial, and that you'll have many, many, many more women scholars. And you already have a wonderful community. I'm so grateful to be in this line of speakers. I want you to just look at this little piece of the ayah from Ahl Imran, Surah Ahl Imran. وَلَيْسَ الذَّكْرَ كَالْأُنْثَى. I'm not going to say too much on this, but I just want you to concentrate on it for a minute or so and think about what this little fragment of this verse raises for you. Have you heard it before in context? Have you maybe read exegesis, read words of different scholars, heard words of scholars on this particular verse that comes in Surah Ahl Imran? And what do you associate with it? What do you think it means? What does it signify? Okay, and I'd like you to do the same for this one. والمؤمنون والمؤمنات بعضهم أولياء لبعض. Sorry, بعضهم أولياء بعض. So, and the believers, men and women, are awliya. This translation has protecting friends, but awliya. Have you noticed this before? What has it said to you in your life? What have you heard taught about this particular concept? And we'll return to these, but I wanted us to just get a little primed from our own experience. So in the Qur'an, we have many voices, many verses that address women and men and the relationship between women and men. And so here you have a verse that talks about the relationship between women and men as a way to find rest in one another. And this might be talking about the relationship between spouses, because we have the azwaj here. But I think it can also give us a sense of what relations can be like between women and men more broadly in society. So we can also think about this cooperative relationship, this awliya'an, this reciprocal relationship here, not only just between azwaj, but also thinking about relationships between other siblings, for instance, or uncles and their nieces, or aunts and their nephews, and all sorts of relationships that in and beyond the family. Now, what I want you to look at in this verse is the idea that there's a mutual relationship, that both parties are finding rest in one another. Now, sometimes this verse in English translations is translated to mean men are finding rest in wives. And that's certainly implied, but the opposite, that women would find rest in husbands, is also within this verse. So be wary if you find English translations of this verse that translate it in a very male-centric perspective, because if we go back to the Arabic, we look here that alayha, this ha goes back to the azwaj. And what we know about azwaj is that it's a mate, a pair, that this is not just a woman. So we can't reduce this verse to men just finding rest in their wives. It's very reciprocal. Now, I often get asked, I served as a university chaplain for many years, and a lot of the young women there wanted to know, well, with all this language about hur'ain in the Qur'an, what does that mean for us? What kind of reward are we getting if all of these men are getting promised women in paradise? And when I went to the Qur'an and I started really looking very closely at all the verses that talk about the hur'ain, they are described using feminine adjectives, but if you know anything about Arabic, you know that many things are described using feminine adjectives, and that doesn't necessarily mean that a thing is feminine. And so this is probably one of my more controversial points in the book, and I look forward to seeing how different scholars will engage this point. But part of what I want to do is show that the Quran never actually talks about nisa in paradise, and it never actually uses like imrat, like either nisa or imrat, both words that mean women. And instead, it's really talking about souls. So a lot of the gendered language, soul being nafs, and a lot of the gendered language could possibly be describing the nafs, which you would describe using the feminine plural, like we saw in the previous verse when we saw alayha. So all that to say that while our tradition tends to focus on the concept of hurain being a woman and tends to focus on male pleasure in paradise, it's certainly the Quranic presentation of kind of rewards in heaven does not necessarily have to be exclusive of women's desires. So here's a verse you've probably seen before. This one is usually quoted in interfaith context because of the reference here to different nations and tribes. But also we have throughout the Quran many instances of this reference to being created male and female. And from this verse doesn't have it here, but from the one soul. And this is very important in the Quran because it establishes that human beings have a common human nature. So nowhere in the Quran do we have verses that talk about a men's nature and a woman's nature. We're from one soul, so we're one humanity, and the Quran very frequently addresses ayyuhan nas, like humanity in general. So sometimes it addresses men and sometimes it addresses women, but the vast majority of verses are actually speaking to our common humanity. And in this, we have this affirmation that there's no inherent superiority of one gender over the other, that taqwa is the ultimate differentiation between people. In addition to the Quran, I just wanted to highlight here, I won't talk about the Hadith tradition much today, but I wanted to highlight just some beautiful verses or beautiful Hadith that talk about the love of a man for women. And you could read this in a romantic sense, but I think it also, just like the other verse, can stand in more broadly for that relationship, that protecting friendship between believers. And of course, here's another hadith, the best of men are those who are best to their wives. Now, here I'm going to turn to a few series of Quranic verses. And this one you might recognize from the end of Surah Al-Tahrim. And here we have the wife of Pharaoh. And what we know about the wife of Pharaoh from the commentary tradition is that she had a very antagonistic relationship, and that she suffered very much at the hands of her husband. And so in a very subtle way, we have here in the Quran a verse that appeals to the unfortunately many women who find themselves in difficult situations of domestic abuse. And you notice here that what she asks for is a house in paradise, next to, near to her Lord. And this desire for the house to be a safe place and a place of welcoming really stands through her dua here. So I keep in my heart all of those women who are struggling to leave abusive relationships. Inshallah, our communities can really step up and support women and believe them when they come forward alleging harm, because we know from sociological studies that it's a very, very, very tiny fraction of women who allege abuse when it doesn't happen. The vast majority of time, if a woman comes forward, that takes a lot of courage, and we should believe her and not encourage her to go back to environments where she's being harmed. So we have in the Qur'an examples of women who are damned. We don't have very many. We have only 3. And when we look across the examples of the many other women in the Qur'an, we find that not only are there just a few women, but we actually don't know very much about them. So the Qur'an doesn't really focus a lot on these women who are damned, but it does, give us these examples. Just like we saw a woman in The Wife of Pharaoh, who, may God be pleased with her, who had to suffer at the hands of a husband. Here we have treacherous wives, those of Nuh and Lut. May God be pleased with Nuh and Lut, who had treacherous wives here. And even though they had very clear access to guidance, went astray. And the Qur'an also gives an example of a couple who are both astray when we look at Tabbat Yaday Abi Lahabin wa Tabb. So we look at the wife of Abu Lahab and see that she is a supporter of her husband, but in doing the wrong. So we have all these different examples when we turn to the Qur'an of different marital relationships. Now, there's, just like we find this balance in terms of the figures that the Qur'an presents in marriage, we also have verses that really clearly affirm the spiritual potential of men and women for being devout, for being the mu'min, for being humble and patient and giving in charity and fasting, and their potential to draw near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so I want us to just stop and appreciate how relatively revolutionary it is to have a scripture that so clearly affirms women's spiritual capacities. As we look across, I teach world religions, and as we look across world religions, we often find that there are in times and places where women get the shorter end of the stick when it comes to representation in religion. And so when we find verses like this that so very emphatically emphasize women's potential for spirituality, and this is quite powerful. So not only do we have verses that in the abstract affirm women's capacity, but then we also have stories that again back up this abstract principle that women have this spiritual acumen that can be just on par with men. And so here's a verse from, this is the last verse of the encounter between Suleiman and Bilqis, the queen of Sheba, Malikat Saba. And here we have very clearly this affirmation of the queen, first of all, saying, verily I wronged myself, in this underline here. And we see that this is a line that numerous prophets say at other points in the Qur'an. So in saying words like this, she's very much echoing prophetic speech at other places in the Qur'an, including in the very next surah in Musa's words, alayhi salam. And so we see that she's drawing near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in tawbah in the very same way that prophets do in other places in the Qur'an. And she's submitting with Suleiman. And interestingly here, it doesn't say to, it says with Suleiman. So it's this affirmation again of this idea of protecting friends. Here you have 2 monarchs. And it's an affirmation of her own piety, just like we saw in the previous verse that affirms women's and men's potential in general terms. And now when we come to Musa, may God be pleased with her, we see here that she actually receives revelation directly in her heart. And if we see this word right here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives her this revelation directly. And she trusts it and she acts upon it. And even when it requires her to do this impossible task of putting her baby into the river. So we see here, it's another affirmation of women's ability to receive a message onto their heart and to act upon it. Musa is surrounded by women in his life who support him. And so not only his mother and not only his sister, which I haven't put a verse here, not only the female family of Pharaoh and Pharaoh's wife, who all support him in his early years, but he also then has women who step into his life later on as well, when he's in this difficult position and stranded in the desert and trying to escape people who would have him killed. So we see here that though his future wife and her sister are convincing their father to keep Moses around for a while. So they sense in him, in the stranger from the desert, all of these good qualities of being strong and trustworthy. And so they have an intuitive sense of who this person is, and are able to convince their father of his value. And now another thing I wanted to highlight about the Qur'an, these are very quick kind of highlights here, and we can go more in depth in the question and answer. But I wanted to highlight that while we have the family of Ibrahim alayhi salam, we also have this almost parallel lineage that's very matrilineal, actually. And so we have the mother of Mary and Mary here, and of course Maryam alayhi salam, the mother of Isa. And we also have this relationship. It might be a sisterhood, it might be a cousin relationship between the wife of Imran and the wife of Zechariah. May God be pleased with all of them. And even though it's very subtle, I think it points to this importance of the mother-daughter relationship. And specifically when we see right here, the mother of Miriam alayhi salam devoting her baby, without knowing the gender of the baby, to the service of her Lord. And she says here that truly you are, meaning her Lord is, hearing and knowing. And then in the very next verse, we see that God affirms, the baby is a girl, as we saw in the previous slides. And then we find this affirmation: truly God chose Adam and Noah and the house of Ibrahim. Notice that house, and the house of Imran, Ahl Imran, above the worlds. So the house of Imran, what we see of the house of Imran in the Qur'an is actually the women of that house. We don't really see Imran at all, except through his women figures. So as progeny, one from another, and God is hearing and knowing. So as much as we have this parallel between Ibrahim and Ibrahim's sons, may God be pleased with the family, we also have this other lineage that is matrilineal in a way. Now, go back. I wanted to point out one thing about this. So you notice that this verse here about God choosing Adam and Noah and the house of Abraham is the 33rd verse of Surah Ahl Imran. Now, there's some parallels here that are really fantastic. In my book, I talk about a lot of parallels in surah structure and things, but just one that I wanted to point out to you today is that this reference to Ahl al-Bayt in Surah Al-Ahzab is actually number 33 as well. So if you see, and there's several other connections between Surah Ahl Imran and Surah Al-Ahzab, which is number 33. So verse 333 and verse 33 are both references to these families of these kind of great houses of noble people in our sacred history. So again, I wanted us to return to, and the male is not like the female. In my experience, sometimes I've seen this verse used in commentaries to degrade women in a way, saying that female intellect or female piety is not like that of men. But if we're returning to this verse through what we've just seen about the power of the matrilineal bond and with regard to the family of Imran, we see that this really probably more correctly should be read as an affirmation of actually the merits of the female as well. So there are differences. We do find differences between, whether they're physiological or otherwise, between men and women or males and females. We can't take this verse to be polemic against women. I kind of running short on time a little bit. There's so much more that I would have liked to share with you. But what I can share with you is I do have this family friends discount, this right here. So if you type this into the Oxford University Press, it does take the book down to a really reasonable amount. And, I am not really making a profit on this. As those of you who are academics maybe know, that academics don't make a huge profit on books, but I really do hope and pray that some of the research and some of the angles that I take in this book can help maybe sometimes women especially feel that, where is my voice within this tradition? Where, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tell me about how to be a woman, or what women in our sacred history have done or accomplished? And so I encourage you to, especially if it's not just for women, but especially if you know people who are lovers of the Qur'an, I hope and pray that this book might be of benefit. And really what I encourage us to do is to continue to redefine women's empowerment, not by adopting Western paradigms or over-sexualizing women. We have a beautiful emphasis in our tradition on modesty and a deep respect for women's intellect and piety. And so, I encourage us to keep finding ways to elevate that and to speak about the beautiful women in our tradition and in our lives. This is just a fun comic that some of you might have seen before from the comic strip The 99. And again, just this reminder from, this is a quote from Rumi, from the Methnawi. So women dominate men of intellect and possessors. Women dominate men of intellect and possessors of hearts, but ignorant men dominate women, for they are shackled by an animal ferocity. And so I don't want to leave you with the thought that women should dominate men, but I do think there's a corrective that we can potentially make by recognizing sort of some of the history, when some of the ways in which maybe as communities we've not really elevated women to the position that Islam would call us to elevate them. And so sometimes we might have to swing just a little bit in the other direction to help get on balance again. This is, I'm wrapping up here. I just want to leave you with a few thoughts. This is from a dear mentor of mine. I came to Islam in my early 20s in the university, and I met Dr. Huda in the context of one of my courses, and she's a dear spiritual teacher and an artist as well. And so she has this, I think this was inspired by the Arab Spring, but I think it can also give us some inspiration to look at our own lives and communities and ask, like, where can we do better with all of these stereotypes that we might have about gender in our own minds that really aren't based in our Islam at all, that are just based in maybe our cultural upbringings. And then I also wanted to encourage you, if you know of non-Muslims who are kind of curious to know a little bit about Islam, this is my first book that came out, and it's an anthology and a collection written by rabbis and pastors and other Muslims who work in interreligious settings. It's a bunch of short stories and artwork, and including that piece actually of the castor oil piece by Dr. Huda. And it's helpful, I think, for introducing non-Muslims to a bit richer of an account of what Islam is and what it teaches. So I just pray that there's benefit in our time, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives me for anything that I've said that is wrong or misguiding, and that we have a rich exchange, inshallah, in the question and answer session. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. آمين. جزاكم الله خيرا.
Thank you so much for that talk. It's a great overview of a deep topic, which I know you've spoken about extensively. Your talk on female archetypes in the Quran, I think it's a couple of hours long in the on YouTube, is very well watched, and alhamdulillah gives much greater insight for those who have the time and would like to see it. We've got 4 questions so far. I'm sure we'll keep on growing as well. So firstly, thank you very much for the talk. You talked about Ohayna when it comes to Maryam alayhi salam, and the fact that she I think was that Maryam? I don't know. You talked about Ohayna when it comes to a leading woman. How does that compare to prophets, and why is it the case that there aren't any women who have received revelation, and the most we see is this Ohayna, which has happened for one person? Does that demonstrate a lack of parity?
Yeah, so as I looked at the stories of women in the Qur'an, we don't find any stories of women actually preaching in the same way that we find prophets preaching. And I think, I'm conversant with the feminist scholarly tradition, and I have to just really be honest here that there is a difference in the way that women are depicted. But what I think is very crucial here is that women are receiving revelation, but this is not a revelation in the sense of a new law that is incumbent upon them to then preach to the masses. Okay, so when we say, we have to acknowledge that women in the Quran do receive revelation. We have right there the Musa alayhi salam. And so it's this difference between drawing near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through this deep personal relationship, and keep in mind that the revelation she receives saves the baby, right? So without this revelation, without her having received it, having acted upon it, how she is the vehicle for saving Musa alayhi salam. And so we can recognize this closeness and this chosenness that she has in this special way. And as we kind of take that out and extrapolate it to maybe our current times, this shows us that women can draw close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they're sometimes tasked with fulfilling kind of different functions in with respect to this. They're not necessarily tasked with the burden of bringing a new law and teaching the people. And people have speculated as to why that is. So, prophets already face enough hardship, and and given the millennia-old tendencies towards sexism, I guess it might be less efficient to send a woman. That's one view that has been articulated, but Allahu Alam. But we do just have to kind of be honest. Even when Maryam alayhi salam, is carrying the baby Jesus, Isa alayhi salam, comes out before her people, she's actually vowed to take silence. So even in that moment where you might expect maybe she says something, she doesn't actually. And this is not to say that women don't speak publicly, because if we look at Bilqis alayhi salam, may God be pleased with her, we see that she very much is in conversation with her entourage and her advisors, and very much is dealing with Suleiman in this diplomatic relationship. So it's not that women are silent or don't transmit knowledge, but we don't find them in this role of bearing law in the same way as we find male figures.
Thank you very much. I guess linked to that is very much the question on Bilqis and the Queen of Sheba. Do you see the role of Bilqis very, very differently compared to all other women in the Quran, who seem to be more often advisory capacity in terms of what they say, whereas Bilqis seems to be in a leadership position?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's a reason behind why the story of Bilqis was shown in that way? And are there lessons on leadership that we have to learn from that?
Yeah, well, certainly. And she's the only woman who is mentioned without some type of other relation. And that's not unique for women, really. We find that among male figures that are mentioned in the Quran as well. Oftentimes, figures are mentioned in some type of family relationship. And we find even in subtle ways, like the Prophet Shu'aib salam, is traveling with his family, or just in very subtle ways, family relationships are elevated even for the prophetic figures. There's a few who we don't see them interacting with family, but when it comes to Bilqis, she's not someone's wife. She's not someone's daughter. I mean, she is obviously someone's daughter, but we don't see her father at all. And I think in our discourses, historically, we have underplayed her role and example. And she's been, for instance, in the tafsir tradition, she's often been sexualized in a way that is just really not really necessary. And that's a way to take a kind of a powerful woman and focus on her legs or something like this. And we see this in the contemporary world as well. I'm in the American context, and we're about to have our first female vice president. And, we still find that it's a hurdle for women to overcome because they are sexualized or subjected to standards that men in leadership are not subjected to. So I think she is an example in many ways of, she's a female diplomat and a really successful one. I mean, she averts war, she forms this alliance. We even, moving beyond our own sacred history, we even find that she's, influential, well beyond the Islamic tradition. If we move and look at, for instance, Ethiopian legend as well, she's very much the female progenitor of Ethiopian sacred history as well. She deserves a lot of attention, I think.
Thank you very much. And another question, which is about the context. Do you think the context of the time in which the Quran was revealed has a bearing on how and which stories are used and in the Quran? Or do you think that because the Quran is a book for all time, the proportions and the number of people and the choices of who is in positions of leadership, etc., is actually for all time? Which of those options do you think actually is more likely?
Yeah, so I think it's a both and. So the Quran is in relation to a historical moment, and it's also contains these wisdoms for all times, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enlightens our heart through it in wherever we may be, in whoever we are reading, there's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts light and guidance in it for us. And so we read simultaneously with both of those perspectives, knowing that it's for all time and knowing that it relates to a specific cultural and political milieu in a unique way. And so it's really not one or the other, it's always both. And so we're always asking, and I do this a bit in the fourth chapter of my book. I say, what was going on in the early Muslim community at the time that these particular verses are said to be revealed? And what does that tell us about the way we should understand gender? But then also, in our contemporary world, what insights can we get for our own dilemmas and our own uncertainties from the Qur'an as well? So you have to do both in order to get the most fruitful readings, I think, and God knows best.
Thank you very much. How do you explain the Qawamun verse and the Daraja verse in the context of what you've talked about?
Yeah, this verse is so bizarre how it's read completely out of context. And I think, for as much as I appreciate all of the knowledge that our mufassir have passed down to us, I think that many cases, if you look at the tafsir tradition, you find blatantly misogynistic explanations of these verses. I mean, so misogynistic to the point that it's just sad. And so that is, we have to say that. And it doesn't mean, these are people, they were in their time, they passed us down a tremendous amount of knowledge. We can be grateful for it. We can also disagree with some of the assertions and say that they're not coherent with the rest of the Qur'an and things. So when we come to it's a big topic, right? Like we could and maybe should at some point do a whole hour on it. But what I can say in the short is that if commentators want to read men's ability to kind of like dominate women into the Quran, I think it's not ultimately coherent with the rhetoric or the spirit. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always finishing verses that relate to gender and gender relations. I was just reading Surah An-Nisa this morning, and you see very much this caution that Allah is all hearing, all seeing, and it's really not for any kind of person to dominate another. So the Qawmun is not a sense of domination at all. That seems pretty antithetical to things that are core and foundational in our tradition. I think Qawmun, if we think about the qiyam, the standing up, it's about taking a certain responsibility. So it's about an ethic of care. And so if we relate it back to the verses that talk about men and women as protecting friends of one another or guardians of one another, I think that's very much where we have to understand this. Like my relationship with my zawj is not going to be functional if I feel controlled and demeaned and belittled. And so we really have to be wary of readings that give men the impression that that should be their relationship with the women in their lives. I think if we stress and emphasize mutual caring and mutual responsibility and mutual consultation, I think we'll see much stronger marital relationships.
Perfect. Thank you very much. One question on your work on interreligious studies. Given your expertise in that area, do you see similar challenges with readings of texts in other faiths? And can you highlight a couple of examples to demonstrate how that works?
Yeah, actually, every time I do interreligious work around questions of womanhood and depictions of women, I'm again just feeling such an tremendous gratitude for all we do have in our tradition in terms of the numbers of women scholars, even though, as I said at the beginning, we don't have nearly the kind of representation that would kind of be lovely to have. But we do have a lot of not only verses, as I pointed out, that affirm women's spiritual potential and things. And I think our struggles are not as much in our textual tradition in terms of foundational sources. I think our struggles are more in the explication of those sources by later generations, and also in the cultural attitudes that I would describe as from the times of Jahiliyyah that still remain in Islam. And not in the religion itself, but in Muslim communities. And so whenever I'm doing the interreligious work on questions of gender, I can really relate to some women's experiences in terms of being sidelined as scholars, or sexist ideas that come out of interpretation. But we're on such firm footing when it comes to our foundational sources. I'm just so grateful. And that's actually, I came into Islam, and part of why I kind of was attracted to it in the first place as a young woman was that strong affirmation that I found in the Qur'an and in the Hadith, and the many women figures in the tradition that were incredibly inspiring. So we're on great footing, and we have a lot to share, and but there's still work to do.
Great. The three questions are very much linked to that, but let me choose Ali Shakara. He's on the call directly. So Ali, can you ask a question directly?
Assalamu alaikum, Doctor. Can you hear me clearly?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So I was listening to your presentation, and I found it very interesting. However, a question came into my mind I couldn't help but think about, which was that your reading of women in the Qur'an, the way you presented them so clearly in your presentation, I can't help but get the impression that historically theologians didn't pay as much attention to women in the Quran, even though, as you brought it out quite clearly. So is your reading and the narrative that you've presented in your presentation, also in your book, is it a contemporary rereading of women in the Quran, or has your interpretation, has your understanding, have you found it in the theological works of the past, and especially, like, for example, the medieval era? It'd be interesting to know.
Yes, that's a great question. And the answer is yes, it's absolutely a contemporary reading. I couldn't give anything other than a contemporary reading because that's kind of who I am, where I am. This is where my experience kind of comes from. But also because I have particular tools that were not as readily accessible to earlier generations of commentators. So I can, for instance, just the vast amounts of places that I can pull information from. Now, our scholars, they were, they had incredible minds and incredible memories, and I'll never approach, what they had just, on their minds. But we have, with all of our digital tools that we have, and all the kind of, the archives that are just accessible at the a fingertip, not a 20-day camel's journey away. There's things that we can do as contemporary scholars that I think questions we can ask and ways we can ask them that just were not possible in the same way as for the medieval commentators. And we are also, just the sheer volume of scholarship, it's incredible. It's like you can't even keep up with it. It's just coming out so quickly. And so alhamdulillah, I think we're in a bit of a renaissance, like the same way paper made new things possible in terms of the transmission of knowledge. The internet is just, one of these once in a millennia, I think, type discoveries. And so when I look, to answer the second part of your question, when I look back, I see there's a lot of commentators. Ibn Arabi, for instance, had brilliant things to say on gender and gender relations and kind of the nature of the one soul. And so that's, certainly somebody. There is an Egyptian exegete from the 1920s and 30s whose treatise was pretty rich. I mean, he had like 5 pages on the women figures of the Qur'an. So, I mean, there were people who were doing this. before, not to the extent that kind of like my own focus, because it comes out of my experience, being a woman, working with other women in a spiritual care capacity and trying to figure out myself. I think part of this comes out of my having grown up as an American like girl with all of the cultural baggage that girlhood means for, in that context, and then being introduced to Islam and trying to figure out where does the truth of this lie in terms of these different depictions of what womanhood should be about. So yeah, it's a very contemporary reading, but inshallah, it's and I mean, inshallah, there's some use and benefit in it, inshallah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the answer. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is from YouTube. If we can show, it's from Sarah Al-Wali, and it's really linking it to, the question is, how do the hadiths link with women in the Quran? Do you see hadiths as supplementary, complementary, or potentially very often antagonistic towards this reading of the Quran?
Yeah, so we can't, the hadith corpus is just so vast. I mean, it's just phenomenal what our scholars have been able to pass down to us and the rigor with which they've documented things. At the same time, we often find that we'll know part of the context of a hadith, but really maybe not the whole context. And sometimes it can raise more questions than it can answer in certain respects. And so, and sometimes Quranic verses are the same way. We don't always have the full context available within reliable sources to understand maybe exactly what the verse was referring to. So there's a lot of, we have to acknowledge that as hard as we strive to identify reliable sources from unreliable sources, that our tradition has like a multiplicity of readings on many issues. And so especially when we come to hadith, it's very hard for any of us who just has sort of an armchair knowledge to understand what the kind of like full meaning and import of given hadith are. And so I don't do that as much. I'm not trained as a hadith scholar, and I think that's a field, I wouldn't do brain surgery because I'm not trained in that. And it's a very similar thing, I feel, still when it comes to hadith. The way I explicate the Qur'an, I'm looking at more of the things that are kind of either the meanings that are like pretty latent but also clear. So I'm looking at word repetitions, or looking at the looking at kind of just semantic relationships. And but when it comes to hadith, there's so much more about context and about it's just not something to play with lightly, and I'm not yet. Maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give me that ability to kind of be more able to work with hadith in a responsible way.
Thank you very much. What's another question on saying no? I think this is linked to Amina Wadud's or the attribution to Amina Wadud. The question is, do you come from a perspective, when you look at the Quran, that is a feminist perspective of equality or justice as your own view onto the Quran, or do you see it as the Quran, a holistic reading of the Quran, pushing you in a certain direction?
Yeah.
And in that situation, if you see a Quranic verse or Quranic verses that appear to be unjust or not in line with some of your views, do you say no to the Quran?
Yeah, I take it just a different approach. I'm really inspired by Amina Wadud. I think she broke open this field in a way for women scholars that without her it would have been a lot more difficult to do potentially. And so I have a great respect and admiration for the work that she's done. And I don't think it's necessary. What let me say here, I think the debates around equality are not very coherent. They don't make much sense. We do very clearly see a different treatment of female-bodied people and male-bodied people in the Qur'an. We see this when it comes to even something as basic as inheritance. There's different shares under different circumstances for different individuals, including places where a woman could potentially receive, like a mother could, in certain circumstances, inherit more than a father. So it's not, most people kind of know, oh, in certain circumstances, a male child could inherit more than a female child. But what we find is that this is part of a system, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made the system in a way that it coheres as a whole. So if we look at individual parts, we might say, well, why is it that in certain circumstances a son would inherit more than his siblings, or his female siblings, or why would it be in certain circumstances that a mother would inherit more than a father? We have to understand the entire picture of how our family relations working and why. So why is it that a man is responsible for paying the living expenses of his wives and his children? And, could that have something to do with the distribution of shares to younger males in a slightly greater ratio than younger females? And in any case, I think if we can talk about equity, I don't think it makes much sense to talk about equality unless you're defining equality as equity fundamentally. I don't have any instances. I have a fundamental belief that the Qur'an is absolutely the guidance when it comes to gender and gender relations. So that's my starting point. And that's a faith-based conviction. So it's not like I can say that that's an academic conviction, but I think I would just encourage people in their own lives to see if they put into practice the guidance of the Qur'an. Has it ever led them wrong? And in my own bringing my own kind of experience to this, it's never been that I've tried to put in place guidance that I received from the Qur'an and it's ever led me wrong. So that's kind of the litmus test in my own personal life, and I encourage other people to kind of adopt that if they're having any doubts.
Perfect. We're actually we're running out of time, so there are two final questions. One is from Kasha. Who, in your opinion, are the most inspirational women in the Quran and in Islamic tradition, and why?
Yeah, so it depends what you're going through in your life, right? So if I'm if I'm pregnant and about to deliver a baby, well, I'm thinking about Maryam's words, and she went into labor and had a lot of pain and wished that she had died and become a thing forgotten. And so that's pretty inspiring that the Quran speaks to the experience of a woman in labor so poignantly. If I'm my husband's fantastic. I adore him. I love him so much. But if we're in an argument, I'm thinking, oh, remember those verses from Surah At-Tahrim, and then I kind of like gravitate towards those verses. Like alhamdulillah, there's guidance for kind of every moment, and that's the point. And even in our contemporary world, if we think about, I talked about the experience of the mother of Musa. We have. I'm coming from the American context. We have women south of our border who are putting their babies in the Rio Grande because they want to give them a better life. And so, these are not just like ancient stories. These are our stories as human people. Like just, this is about lived experience. And I think when we, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the Quran filled with stories because we as human beings love stories. Our brain just like literally like lights up, the neurons like start firing when we hear stories. But our lives are stories too, and we're constantly trying to make sense of our own lives. And so the Quran gives us direct guidance in the form of do this, don't do that, but then it also gives us stories so that we can kind of contemplate and tadabbur and tafakkar fi like the meanings.
Thank you very much. And the final question from YouTube, it's from Medina Fatima. Assalamu alaikum, Celene. Thank you for the talk and very insightful. You made reference to Quranic verse numbers when the Quran is neither chronological nor thematic, and I think this is in relation to verse 33. Could you expand on this briefly?
Yeah, so I talk about in my book certain correspondences that are really beautiful. And I'll give you just one example. In Surah Al-Baqarah, when we hear the couple kind of speaking, this primordial couple, Adam and his spouse, his Zawj, and then we look at those verse numbers, look at verses, and I can't pull it up right now, but I encourage people to look, 35 to 37. And then we go to Surah Ahl Imran, and we look at Ahl Imran, we look at those verses 35 to 37. The first, in Surah Al-Baqarah, those verses 35 to 37 in Surah Al-Baqarah are the first time that God speaks to like the primordial couple. And then the exact same verses are the first time we see a woman speaking to God in the context of kind of making this prayer, dedicating her baby to God. So there's certain structural parallels, and they're very subtle. Those of you who have studied Surah Maryam in great detail realize that there's a lot of structural parallels in the beginning of Surah Maryam. And all this Surah Tahrim also has very interesting structural parallels. And so all of this is when you kind of contemplate the Quran, some of this comes out. Also the verses on Uruban Atraban that refer to companions of like age in paradise. Again, this is going back to the issue I raised about the Hur'ain and heavenly rewards. We find that both those words, urub and atraban, it has to do with being equal, and both of those roots appear the exact same number of times in the Quran. Just little things like that. I always enjoy the kind of subtle artistry of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I think the more we connect with the Quran, and the more, inshallah, all of these little gems will pop out. May Allah bless people who love the Quran and who hold firmly to it. It is the rope of our deen, inshallah.
Just want to check, Medina, you wanted to ask or follow up directly. Are you in? Nope, she hasn't yet joined in. She wanted to ask directly, but I don't know if we'll have time if she can't join. So I'll give her another 10 seconds, sorry.
Yeah, she's welcome to email me and to be in contact.
Yeah. Nope, I don't think she has. So I think, sorry. No, she hasn't. Okay, no worries. Sorry, she is now. Medina, please continue.
Oh,
you show your
sorry, can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
I just had a sort of, slightly technical question. So you made a comment about certain verses and how they correlate to 33, and a lot of people make these observations in the Quran. But my basic understanding is the Quran isn't ordered, so it's not ordered chronologically. It's just ordered based on the length of the surah. So when people make those reference, what do they mean when the initial surahs are not based? Do you know what I mean? I don't know if I'm explaining it properly.
Yes, no. So I think there is some conversation around if the order is in fact ordained by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or if the surahs came down separately and the companions are the ones who put it into place. And I take the former opinion as the stronger one. And I do that not only because because I see parallels in terms of one surah ending and another starting and picking up similar themes and sometimes having really clear structural parallels. But I mean, it is an open, we don't have necessarily, we have early Quranic manuscripts that have them in a particular order, but we don't necessarily have definitive proof of it at exactly what point they were put in that order. That's sort of a matter of individual discernment in a sense, or whatever authority that you follow on that matter.
Okay.
Thank you, Medina. I always like John Burton on this. He's my favorite author who's written on the Quran, the ordering of the Quran. He comes to a similar conclusion on what's it called, on it all being collated in that order at the time of the Prophet, which is quite interesting. Thank you so much for the talk today, and you could see that the audience was buzzing with questions, and we had to cut it a little bit short. I'm sorry that for those who did have questions who we weren't able to pass across, and maybe if we're lucky and Dr. Ibrahim is willing, we might be able to get her again at some point, because this is, obviously I know you're very busy, and it may not always be possible. So but thank you so much for coming today. Thank you so much for sharing your views. Thank you very much for answering the questions, and thank you for talking to us in our small little community here in London, all the way from America. So thank you very, very much for everything.
Jazakumullah khairan. It's just keep up your great work. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continue to increase you in blessing and in benefit for the people, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much. Just a couple of quick announcements before we finish for everyone. Please do stay on whilst I share them with you. Firstly, as you can see on the screen, we have a range of lectures coming up. The next 2 weeks, actually, on the 25th and the 1st, because they're Christmas Day and New Year's Day, we've chosen not to have talks. But then Dr. Shadab Rahmatullah on Islam and Liberation Theology, his book on the topic. Professor Rainus Lewis, one of the world leaders actually in the field of modest fashion. She's written numerous books on the topic: modest fashion, commerce, community, and controversy. Fatima Agha talking about Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam, and the week after Munawwar Grami from South Africa talking about conceptualizing courage and resistance in the life of Zainab alayhi salam, the daughter of Imam Ali alayhi salam. And then Aziz Al-Kun, who'll talk about the genocide of Uyghur Muslims in East Turkestan in China, and obviously he comes from the Turkestan community and the Uyghur community, so he obviously has great insight into that. Just before we finish, I'd like to also talk about a conference that we're holding next on December 27th. That's Sunday. It's on the late Ayatollah Sana'i, who was a scholar in Iran, and his work and impact on Islamic law. You will see his views talked about by some of the leading scholars and less leading scholars on the topic. But Ayatollah Sayyid Muhaqiq Damad will be speaking about the jurisprudential school of Qum in the 21st century and how he comes from that and how he's related to that. Ayatollah Dr. Rahim Nobahar is one of his students will be talking about his approach to equality under Islamic law. Dr. Ali Reza Bajani will be talking about how this all fits in methodologically with a continuity and change in interpretation of Sharia, and he'll be looking at the legal status of non-Muslims to be able to explain how his Ayatollah Sani's unique views on that demonstrate something when it comes to his perspectives. And then Dr. Masuma Rad Gudazi will be talking about the theological foundations of Ayatollah Sani's view on women and minority rights, because Ayatollah Sani is the only Shia scholar, as far as I'm aware at least, who for example, believes that women should lead. Women are allowed to lead prayers when both men and women are in the congregation. And then I will be speaking on a range of his non-mainstream fatwas and the way that he explains and derives them in Islamic law, and his explanations, and that will hopefully give an insight into how he thinks. And finally, we have Sheikh Kumail Rajani, who will be taking the next step and saying, what is the future of progressive thinking within the Hawza after the death of Ayatollah Sani, taking into account a lot of Ayatollah Sani's quite controversial opinions, and therefore whether there is a future in this, in what he's called progressive thinking, what Sheikh Kumail Rajani. So hopefully this will be a really interesting conference starting at 12:15 p.m. And finishing at 4 p.m. on next Sunday. Please do join. You can register online, or you can just come onto our YouTube channel, where it will be streamed live as well as on Facebook. So and you can obviously ask lots of questions. There's over an hour worth of question time within that conference. So looking forward to seeing you then. Thank you all very much for joining. Thank you very much for asking your questions, and hopefully we'll see you again in future talks. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.